John Taylor, our next 2010 Bradley Prize recipient, is a world-renowned economist known for his research on the foundations of modern monetary theory and policy and for his experience in international economics. He has an active interest in public policy and has served at various senior levels in government. Born in Yonkers, New York, Dr. Taylor received his bachelor's degree in economics summa cum laude from Princeton University and holds a PhD in economics from Stanford. Dr. Taylor is the Marion Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford and the George P. Shultz Senior Fellow in Economics at the Hoover Institution. Dr. Taylor was the founding director of the innovative Stanford Introductory Economics Center and has served as director of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, where he is now a senior fellow. Known for his dramatic flair in teaching college economics, Dr. Taylor held positions as professor of economics at Princeton and Columbia before joining the Stanford faculty in 1984. A pioneer in developing new approaches to monetary policy, he coined the Taylor Rule, as it's called, in 1993, which central banks have used since then to help determine interest rates. Put simply, perhaps too simply, it's the idea that you raise short-term interest rates to cool the economy when inflation or output become too high, and you lower rates when either falls too low. Dr. Taylor has also been active in public policy, serving as the Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs during the first term of George W. Bush. Among other things, he was responsible for U.S. policies in international finance, which includes currency markets, trade and financial services, foreign investment, international debt and development, and oversight of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. His book, Global Financial Warriors, The Untold Story of International Finance in the Post-9/11 World, chronicles his time as Undersecretary. In the past, he has served as senior economist on President Ford's and President Carter's Council of Economic Advisors and as a member of President George H.W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors. He has been a member of the Congressional Budget Office's panel of economic advisors and a senior economic advisor to the Bob Dole, George W. Bush, and John McCain presidential campaigns. He is currently a member of Governor Schwarzenegger's Council of Economic Advisors. His recent book, Getting Off Track, How Government Actions and Interventions Caused, Prolonged, and Worsened the Financial Crisis, was one of the first on the financial crisis, and he has since followed up with 2 books on preventing future crises, co-editing The Road Ahead for the Fed and Ending Government Bailouts as We Know Them, in which leading experts examine and debate proposals for financial reform and exit strategies. He has received several awards for his distinguished public service. In 2007, he was awarded the Adam Smith Award from the National Association for Business Economics for his work as a groundbreaking researcher, public servant, and teacher during a career of more than 30 years and his outstanding leadership in the field of economics. Professor Taylor has received multiple awards for excellence in teaching, including the Hoagland Prize and the Rhodes Prize. He was awarded the Alexander Hamilton Award for his overall leadership in international finance at the U.S. Treasury, the Treasury Distinguished Service Award for designing and implementing the currency reforms in Iraq, the Medal of the Republic of Uruguay for his work in resolving the 2002 financial crisis, and the George P. Shultz Distinguished Public Service Award. Professor Taylor received a Guggenheim Fellowship for his research, and he is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Econometric Society. He formerly served as Vice President of the American Economic Association. He has contributed to the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the Financial Times, the New York Times, and has been a frequent guest on CNBC, Fox Business News, Tavis Smiley, and Bloomberg TV. His accomplishments include helping to assemble an international coalition to freeze terrorist assets, expediting Afghanistan's economic reconstruction, creating a new currency and central bank in Iraq, forging an international agreement to reduce Iraq's debt by 80%, and creating a new economic engagement with broader Middle East and North African countries.
You can't take an interest in the global economy or the Fed or monetary policy or macroeconomics without knowing of John Taylor. He's a rock star of the world of monetary policy and monetary theory.
John has a wonderful mind, so he starts out with that good piece of equipment which he's trained and developed, so that when he decides to speak, it's because he has something to say that's a little different from what other people are saying. And so that causes you to take notice.
John Taylor is an eminent monetary economist, but a fine economist in other dimensions too. His work in monetary policy sets the framework by which everyone talks about monetary policy.
John, more than anybody else, has taught the economics profession what has to be done to control inflation. And what's called the Taylor Rule has been a guide not only for the Federal Reserve, but for central banks around the world.
We would have been a lot better off if our central bank, I think, had followed the Taylor Rule a little bit more carefully.
He is an educator. It's the DNA of John. And by educator, I mean someone who is deeply interested in your learning.
And John is quite famous for inventing ways to try to get students engaged.
Once in his introductory course at Stanford, he, talking about the raisin industry in California, dressed up as a bag of raisins and paraded out on the stage. I think probably the students remember that as much as anything else in the course.
He's a believer in democratic capitalism. He's a tremendous advocate for the power of markets to solve problems. He's a tremendous voice for freedom and for the power of freedom.
We're pleased to present the 2010 Bradley Prize to John Taylor.
I'm truly grateful to the Bradley Foundation for this great honor. I remember, I'll never forget, when Mike called me on the phone to give me the news. I particularly remember the conversation we had about all the previous winners, the people you see on both sides of this stage, people who I admire greatly. And I also want to congratulate my fellow prize winners tonight. It's an honor to be sharing this stage with them. What I'd like to do mainly tonight is tell some stories. I learned long ago that stories were a good way to explain difficult economic ideas. You know, Adam Smith told great stories. You might not know that Adam Smith frequently comes to my lectures at Stanford. Of course, he speaks through the heavens, from the heavens. He actually comes through the PA system in the auditorium. He almost always interrupts me in mid-sentence. Professor Taylor, he'd speak, Professor Taylor, you talked about the benefits of free markets, and you didn't tell your students about my story of the pin factory. Well, let me tell them about it. And then he'd go on and tell the students as they listened, probably pretty interested in his famous story, the pin factory, reading from The Wealth of Nations. Actually, it wasn't Adam Smith, it's me acting Adam Smith's role. Another great storyteller who I admire is Milton Friedman. He told great stories. The one that I like the most is his story about the famous pencil, which illustrates the power of the markets and the magic of the price system. So Milton would hold up a pencil, and he'd point to the eraser coming from Malaysia, and the wood coming from the state of Washington, and the lead, which he admitted wasn't really lead, and describe the amazing amount of work and the thousands of people that went into this so that you and I could buy this simple pencil. You know, Milton's pencil story, the one he tells, it's now on YouTube. Just type in pencil Milton and watch. You know, I really wish Adam Smith was on YouTube. Speaking of Milton, it reminds me of a time when I was a member of President Bush 41's Council of Economic Advisors. You might remember those revenue enhancements. Well, I was given the job of calling some economists to muster up a little support for this. They put Milton on my list. So I dutifully called Milton at the Hoover Institution, and before I could even pose the question, he said, "John, I know why you're calling, and the answer is no." And by the way, come back to Stanford right away. Washington is corrupting you. Sometimes it helps to act out stories. When my children were young, 5 years old, 3 years old, they would join me on the lecture stage to illustrate things like the permanent income hypothesis. My son would find a $10 bill on the stage, and he'd hold it up and said, "I'm only going to spend 50 cents of this," 5 years old. "I'm only going to spend 50 cents of this because it's not a permanent increase in my income. I can only spend 5%. And then I'd tell my daughter that she's getting a permanent increase in her income for babysitting, her hourly income for babysitting, a permanent increase. And she says, "I'm spending all of that because it's permanent." I really wish some members of Congress had seen that lecture. We might have avoided this stimulus program, which simply sent checks to people hoping they were going to spend it when they knew it was purely temporary. You know, I'm really happy that my daughter, Jan, and her husband, Josh, who are here tonight, have allowed me to bring my granddaughter, Olivia, to class now that she's able to. And you might have noticed in this video, I didn't know it was going to be quite like this, but none of us, I think, knew what these videos were going to be like. I was afraid it was going to be a roast, but not a roast. But you might have noticed that there was a place where I walked into the lecture hall at Stanford with my 5-month-old granddaughter, Olivia. Again, thanks to my daughter and her husband letting me do this. I did it because, you also might have noticed, I had these charts that I showed the students about the exploding debt that this country was facing, just going, you know, these curves that just look unbelievable. So I lectured my students and told them about it, and I'm not quite sure they really understood how important and how potentially devastating those charts are if we don't fix it. So I had the idea, well, maybe Olivia could come and give a guest lecture to the class. She's 5 months old, so what you saw was her coming in, little snippets of our guest lecture. Fortunately, she turned around and looked at those charts, those exploding charts up on the screen, looked at them, appeared to whisper in my ear, and I said to the students, she said, "Fix it." And that's what I pledged to do, fix it. Economic stories are good outside the classroom, too, of course. I remember when I was working for the Treasury as Undersecretary, giving a dinner address to some Russian visitors. Don Evans, who was the Commerce Secretary at the time and spoke at lunch that same day, warned me that it was a tough crowd and not very interested in economics. So I was introduced. I was supposed to talk about free trade and the benefits of trade between our countries. So I was introduced and started my lecture, and sure enough, the audience just kept talking, basically ignoring me completely, just as Don Evans had warned. But then it came to part of the talk which was a story, again, about my children years ago and a trip to Russia, where my daughter stepped on Peter the Great's trick fountain, and my son enjoyed a circus in Moscow. And so I announced to the skeptical group, now I want to tell a story. Instantly, they stopped talking with each other and were attentive like I've never seen an audience before as they listened to my story of my daughter being drenched by Peter the Great's fountain, or my son laughing his head off at the Russian clowns. By the way, those are both free trade stories. When I went back to free trade in the abstract, they went back to their talk. Shows you the power of stories. Ronald Reagan knew the importance of telling stories to illustrate not just economic freedom, but political freedom. One of his best stories, in my view, was the one about a Russian and American debating about their country. And the American says, you know, in my country, I can go into the Oval Office, I can pound on the president's desk, and I can say, I don't like the way you're running the country. And the Russian said, well, I can do that. And the American says, you can? He says, sure. I can go into the Kremlin, I can go into the General Secretary's office, I can pound on his desk, and I can say, I don't like the way President Reagan is running this country. Obviously, President Reagan can tell that story a little better than I can. I like to tell the story about how I recently started speaking out about the role of government in the recent financial crisis. I was scheduled to give a keynote address in honor of the outgoing governor of the Bank of Canada, David Dodge. He's retiring, so they asked me to come and give a keynote address for the conference in his honor. This was in November 2008. And I'd been researching the financial crisis since before it began and thought that, well, for this talk, I'll sort of gather together my thoughts. And what I soon discovered is not only, in my view, did my research lead me to the point that government caused the financial crisis, it also prolonged it and made it much worse. So as I began to think, well, maybe I have some second thoughts. This is not the best talk, keynote address for the outgoing governor of one of the major central banks. And in addition, many of the other guests at the event would be the people whose decisions I was going to say were part of the problem, not part of the solution. So I asked my wife, Lynn, who's here in the audience, what she thought. What should I do? She said, I have a quote here, "If that is what you believe, then you should go ahead and say it." So I did. And later, when I expanded that speech into a book, one of the first books on the financial crisis, I dedicated it to Alin. Thank you, Alin. Family is an important source of support for me and most people. My mother, who passed away just this March, taught me to stand up for what I believe in. First by telling me to stand up to the bullies in the streets or in the schoolyards. I don't want to hear you complaining, she would say. Just go out and deal with the problem yourself. You know, bullies are still out there, Mom. I like how people like Governor Chris Christie call some of the teachers' unions bullies because they're perpetuating an unaccountable education system. I especially like his line to the bullies, "You punch them, I punch you." I'm glad my father could be here tonight. He also taught me how to stand up by example. For example, by serving our country in the Pacific in World War II. And my son also has inspired me, again, by example, by serving in the United States Marine Corps for 6 years, fighting in the global war on terror. Just off this auditorium, and I hope you have a chance to go out and look, although it's hard at night, but there's a view from the West Roof Terrace across the Potomac. And when I think of this view, I think of President Reagan's first inaugural address, which talked about a similar view. He was speaking from the west front of the Capitol. It's actually the first time an inaugural address was given from the west front. And of course, he would be looking down the mall and looking at the monuments. And he said, and I'll quote, exactly, "Beyond those monuments to heroism, is the Potomac River. And on the far shore of the sloping hills of Arlington National Cemetery, with its row upon row of simple white markers bearing crosses or stars of David, they add up to only a tiny fraction of the price that has been paid for our freedom." I want to finish tonight with a story about government bailouts, which I believe have become a threat to both our economic freedom and to our political freedom. I went to Washington to run the International Division of the Treasury back in 2001. And at that time, emerging market countries were experiencing in the midst of a series of financial crises that really began in the 1990s. They were also plagued by, I think, a highly discretionary and chaotic bailout process. The creditors of Mexico were bailed out in 1995. Then some Asian countries were bailed out in 1997, but some weren't. Russia and its creditors were bailed out for several years, and then suddenly in 1998, the plug was pulled, causing worldwide contagion. So my goal coming into government in 2001 was to try to end this bailout mentality. It was creating uncertainty that I could see, and I think it also reduced incentives for emerging market countries to put their financial affairs in order. I didn't find it easy to make these changes, not easy at all. The bailout mentality was entrenched at the U.S. Treasury, and quite frankly, it's hard for government officials to say no to bailouts because you worry, for example, that a sovereign default could cause widespread harm. So what did we do? We looked for a way to make it easier to say no by finding alternative to bailouts. The most workable alternative that we could find that was practical was to ask emerging market countries to include clauses in their debt, in their sovereign bonds. These clauses would allow for an orderly market-based workout rather than a disorderly default and a need for a bailout in the event the country faced financial difficulties. So we worked with our emerging market colleagues, in particular one I remember well and thank my counterpart from Mexico, Agustin Carstens, who now, by the way, is the central bank governor of Mexico. And the Mexicans led the way by inserting these market-based clauses into their debt. And I think it made a world of difference. The second thing we did was pledge to help countries who were experiencing collateral damage from other countries who were going into default because of the policies being incorrect. And that's what we did. We did provide help to offset the collateral damage. For example, by helping Uruguay when they were hit, when Argentina no longer got a bailout and went into default in 2001. As a result of this, there was virtually no contagion after the Argentinian bailout in 2001, the Argentinian default in 2001, whereas just 3 years earlier in 1998, there was massive contagion and fallout. I think also these changes led many of the emerging market countries, recognizing that bailouts were less likely, to dramatically change their policies, to do things such as keep their debt from rising, actually reduce their debt, to do things like get their inflation rate down, to increase their foreign reserves. I think it shouldn't be any surprise that emerging markets countries have fared so much better in this crisis than anyone would have thought, and in fact better than the developed countries themselves. Unfortunately, the government bailout mentality is back, and it's right here in the United States. To me, the on-again, off-again bailout policy that sometimes bailed out, sometimes did not bail out the creditors of financial institutions in 2008, I think that led to the financial panic ultimately. And it's reminiscent in my time of seeing the on-again, off-again bailout process for emerging market countries in their crisis period too. And last month, what do we see? European countries resorted to bailing out the creditors of Greece and other European countries in an eerie replay of the 1990s emerging market crisis. So, where does that leave us? Actually, I think there's some good news. The good news is that people are disgusted with the government bailouts. The challenge will be to channel this disgust into real action. I hope this story, in fact, I hope my other stories, indicate that the task is feasible and that the rewards are great. Thank you very much.